But just remember this. One Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives and what we think and say and do. We don't live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come when, if men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire, blood, and anguish. Good night. So ends J.B. Priestley's Inspector in his famous play, An Inspector Calls. The inspector in question had visited, the house of a wealthy manufacturer named Arthur Burling and his family. The Burlings were celebrating his daughter Sheila's engagement to an upper-class gentleman, Gerald Croft, in what was meant to be a night of genteel revelry. The police inspector disrupts their joy with his questions and eventual recriminations, the last of which culminated in the speech that we just heard. But what does it all mean? Who are these John and Eva Smiths for whom we are responsible? Why are their lives any of our business? What does the inspector mean by fire, blood, and anguish? Hello, and welcome back to There's a Book for That, a podcast in which I, Rumbi, a bookworm, talk about books I have read and try to understand their lessons and apply them to everyday life. Today we are talking about An Inspector Calls, a play by English writer and broadcaster J.B. Priestley. The play, written in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, was set much earlier in 1912. From the BBC website we learn, quote, An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley is a play that revolves around the apparent suicide of a young woman called Eva Smith / Daisy Renton. I'm going to be using these names interchangeably throughout this episode. Quote continues. In the play, the unsuspecting Burling family are visited by the mysterious Inspector Gould. He arrives just as they are celebrating the engagement of Sheila Burling to Gerald Croft. The inspector reveals that a girl called Eva Smith has taken her own life by drinking disinfectant. The family are horrified, but initially confused as to why the inspector has called to see them. What follows is a tense and uncomfortable investigation by an all-knowing inspector, through which the family discover that they are all, in fact, caught up with this poor girl's death. End quote. So I first had the idea for doing this podcast, this episode, when I was reading the Financial Times in January 2023. The word Polycrisis was used as the year in a word, so a word used to describe the entire year, by columnist Jonathan Derbyshire to describe the complexity of the political world as it stood at that time, as it stands. Quote, Polycrisis, noun, collective term for interlocking and simultaneous crises of an environmental, geopolitical, and economic nature, end quote. I thought this was apt, but could be better used to describe what ordinary people have been going through for the past however long we want to go back. For our purposes, we can go back to 2008, which is a recent point where we can remember what life felt like, how we had prospects and hope, etc. For the younger generation, it may well be 2019. And for older listeners, perhaps the Quaalude-fueled days of the 80s when greed was good, and it looked as though the financial markets would always be bullish. I like the word polycrisis. First used in the late 90s, by French social scientists Edgar Morin and Anne-Brigitte Guerin, who employed it to describe the interwoven and overlapping crises facing humanity, especially in the ecological sphere. It was then popularized in a speech by Jean-Claude Juncker on 21 June 2016 at a speech he gave to the AGM of the Hellenic Federation of Enterprises in Athens, saying, quote, I have often used the word polycrisis to describe the current situation. Our various challenges, from the security threats in our neighbourhood and at home, to the refugee crisis and to the UK referendum, have not only arrived at the same time, they also feed each other, creating a sense of doubt and uncertainty in the minds of our people. End quote. In this episode, I will extrapolate this meaning and bring it home to ordinary folks and try to balance the difficulties of life rather than these most lofty state-based notions of Juncker and the FT. But the logic will remain the same. That is, modern crises, and perhaps all crises, are interlocked. They feed each other, one adding fuel to another's fire, making it worse. And without tackling them all, almost simultaneously, it is impossible to really make progress. Players of games like Civilization and Crusader Kings will understand that you need to find a sweet spot by moving the levers, moving the variables around. How much money do you put here? Do you start a war there? Do you ignore this demographic? So that the minimum number of people are unhappy or losing out. When enough people like you, or at least enough don't actively hate you, when you release new policies, that's a win. Likewise, most of us navigate life in this way, deciding what we can afford to buy today and what we can afford to wait for till the next payday. But in a polycrisis, everything happens at once, or at least consecutively, without any space in between to gather up your strength and get back to a baseline that allows you to get back on your feet. This can have tragic consequences, as we find out in the play. So, I first read an Inspector Calls for GCSE over 20 years ago because I'm terrifically old. I really liked the play. The characters were vivid. The moral of the story was unambiguous. The mysterious Inspector Gould outlined the trajectory of Eva Smith's life in a sympathetic fashion, highlighting the many ways in which she tried. She really did. She tried to improve her life before finally giving in to the cruel entropy which had been snapping at her heels like a rabid dog. At the time, I was immediately in Daisy's camp. She deserved better, I thought. She really did try. But at every turn, she was hampered by people with more money and power who could therefore ensure her demise. A familiar story. So I wanted to do this episode so I could better understand Daisy's world, the world that Priestley wrote about, that now it seems really distant. You're like, 110 years ago, wow, it's a long time ago. But in this episode, I want to compare what we're talking about when we talk about extreme poverty, when we talk about social mobility, in the light of the UK and its levelling up policies. I'm recording this on the 5th of July when the outgoing Conservative government, as I will now be referring to them, they've had these ideas about bringing people up, making it more equal for everybody. But these ideas were not new. And so the world that Daisy lives in is a world that is very familiar today. It's simply that we might not realize. And so in this episode, that's what I want to talk about. As a result, this episode is very UK-centric. Not because the issues here are particular to the UK, but because they played out differently in different countries. And so in order to do this justice, I would have to go country by country and talk about what it was like at that at the end of the Edwardian period, the late 1800s. I will be talking about an American economist briefly, but only to make the generic salient point about education that it was the focus of his analysis. Sticking to the UK will then allow me to talk about where we are now, because I really want to make that comparative statement about poverty today in the UK. So in the section where I talk about poverty, I'll be contrasting the progress that has been made over the past 112 years since the book's setting, not when it was written. So, the author of our play, John Boynton Priestley, was born in Bradford in 1894. His father, Jonathan Priestley, was a pioneering schoolteacher who instilled a strong belief in helping others into his son. Growing up in Bradford, Priestley seems to have been surrounded by people who saw socialism as the only logical political ideology, and this definitely coloured his views for the rest of his life. As headmaster of Green Lane Elementary School, Jonathan Priestley, the father, was the first head to administer the first free school meals in the country. Those of us who grew up near or on the poverty line or below it would know what a lifesaver that was. For those of you in the UK, You might remember the furore over the footballer Marcus Rashford insisting that children should receive free school lunches during the holidays a few years ago. This is because even in 2021, when that was happening, there were children whose only chance to have a solid meal was at school because their families were that poor. Some things never change. Jonathan Priestley's school also provided free milk, free medicals, and had the first school baths in the UK. Priestley inspired his son to be public-spirited and hardworking, which is why he then volunteered to go and fight in the First World War. Unfortunately, as happens with war, the experience changed him negatively, and he came back with an even more pronounced understanding of what it means to live in a society, leading to the writing of all his works as well as his social activism, including his advocacy work for the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I will keep referring to Priestley's politics and mindset because in this case it's very relevant. I'll have it known that this is not an endorsement of Priestley. He had some very good points, but he also had some very strange and horrible views. So there we go. Priestley was writing to be understood by ordinary people in the UK, while saying important things about society that he felt were necessary. And Inspector Calls is not a neutral exploration of the role of capitalism or personal prejudice in determining the fate of a poverty-stricken young woman. It is a morality tale, and that preachy speech that I started with was meant to hit theatre goers and give them something to think about. And so as we go along, I will aim to convey the importance of that intention. I will also look at the historical setting of the story, really digging into what it means to be poor at the end of the Edwardian era in England, examining the changes that would have affected the life of a real-life Daisy Renton, a real 19 or 20-year-old woman in 1912. From education or the lack thereof, the role of trade unions and collective bargaining, which feature in the story as the reason why Daisy got fired from her job, or even the role of contraception and how that worked for the rich and the poor. Having done all this and interspersed with all this, I'll also be talking about poverty then and now to see how far we have come, up or down. I think it's important to ask what Priestley would think about today's world. This is for you. Would Eva, for example, have had a better time in 2022 than in 1912? In some areas, yes, and some maybe not. I will look at some statistics and try to answer that question. But at the back of my mind, and maybe at the back of your minds too, is the thought that with all the wealth flying around, that means that people can eat gold on their chicken wings, which is the cheapest cut of the meat. So when you eat gold on your chicken wings, you're really saying fuck you to the poor. At least if you eat steak and you put gold on that, steak might have been out of their reach anyway, but you're buying poor people's food to make it inaccessible to them. Anyway, with all the wealth flying around, that means that rich people can eat gold on their chicken wings, and the outgoing UK Prime Minister is one of the richest people in the country. I want to compare Eva's world with our own, examining Priestley's work in the time that he set it, and not the time that he wrote it. We're going to go right back. So here we go. So the play is set in 1912, at the tail end of the Victorian/Edwardian age, when social mobility was slowly rising. For example, we learn that Arthur Burling, while wealthy, is not himself from money. So if he's not from money but he managed to be wealthy, he's already done social mobility and succeeded, but now he's looking at going another rung up the ladder. He is what people would have called new money, which is wealth gained in industry by working, not just by having lots of land from the last 500 years and exploiting people. It means that he's got new money to exploit people. But it also means that he was unaccompanied by the gentility of good breeding, generational wealth, and the refined social mores of the age. We get hints that he's still a bit rough around the edges in the way that he speaks and the way his wife speaks to him. Sybil, his wife, is a little more refined than he is, and Gerald, his daughter's new fiancé, is from an upper-class family who are not entirely on board with the match, because class is really important. Arthur is obviously aware of his shortcomings and waves a potential knighthood in the next honours list under his new son-in-law's nose as an indication of his rising social status. Quote, "But what I wanted to say is there's a fair chance that I might find my way into the next honours list. Just a knighthood, of course." He continues, I've always been regarded as a useful party man, so, well, I got it, there's a very good chance of a knighthood, so long as we behave ourselves and don't get into the police court or start a scandal, eh? End quote. Looking back at the Edwardian period, and even today, the UK is a country in which class is everything. It's not enough to be wealthy in Edwardian England, and perhaps even today, when a regional accent is still an indication of one's social status. For those unfamiliar with the British honour system, a knighthood, or a knight bachelor, is granted to individuals for their public service. As an industrialist and a magistrate, Burling would have demonstrated this, and so his sovereign at the time, King George V, would have rewarded him with the title Sir Arthur Burling. Fancy. It's a pretty big deal, which is why he would have wanted to avoid all appearance of a scandal, such as being linked to a dead girl. Priestley, in writing his play, chose to set it 2 years before the First World War, injecting some ironic hindsight into the first act when Burling confidently downplays the possibility of war and talks about the Titanic as an amazing thing, when we all know that it drowned on its maiden voyage. However, there are other reasons for choosing this pre-war period. For one, we learn that Arthur Burling fired Eva for organising and demanding more money as part of a collective action. She was a ringleader, and he wanted to make an example of her. Quote, "We let them all come back at the old rates." Here he's talking about the previous staff. So they had gone on strike because they wanted more money, as you do. And it wasn't that they wanted much more money. I think they wanted 4 shillings. I don't have the conversion for what that is. But let's just say we're talking going from 8 of whatever your money is to 9 of whatever your money is. So they fire everybody, and then everybody realizes that they don't have a job and they can't get anything else. And so he says, "We let them all come back at the old rates." He's basically said, you're never getting a pay rise. Except the 4 or 5 ringleaders who'd started the trouble. I went down myself and told them to clear out. And this girl, Eva Smith, was one of them. She'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. End quote. Eva was a significant person in that collective action, and she gets fired as a result. But then she's able to find a job in a shop, which was something new at that time because of factors that we'll talk about later. I found these 2 things interesting because they're direct results of the policies and changing social structures of the late Edwardian era, because of these developments that had been building for a couple of centuries, but which had really started to take hold at that tail end of the Edwardian era. These are the 2 things we're going to start by talking about. The glorious development of trade unions and the wider availability of public education for children. I will start with an examination of the impact of trade unions, the reason why Eva was fired, collective action and people coming together to say, if we work together, we can make more money, we can have better conditions. So let's rewind, as 1912 is already too late to tell the story of trade unions. They have a long history in other forms, such as medieval guilds, but I'll talk more about that in the episode on Ready Player One. For today, suffice it to say that as early as 1549, people had already figured out that there was power in numbers, and they'd started coming together to ask for better wages. However, the employers had also figured this out, and they were doing the same, organizing themselves into federations to prevent what they called conspiracies. Conspiracies were, these people coming together and asking for more money. And because it's a negative word, we know that it was embedded in there, the idea that this is a bad action. Whereas federation has no connotations in that sense. Oh, we're a federation, you don't think anything. Whereas if someone says they're a conspiracy, you hear it. Now, guilds had existed for centuries, providing education through long apprenticeships, which prepared people for work, and then supporting members of the guilds with what we would think of today as a social safety net, though they were significantly more limited. However, these were only for skilled workers, really, the masons, the tailors, the weavers, the potters, etc., and not the average person who might be in domestic service or working in the fields. And so the development of these conspiracies meant that more and more people were coming together from different sectors to support one another against the cruelty of employers. Maybe they started with just each other, but then as time went on, they were starting to bring in more people. Combinations or collective bargaining movements meant that for the first time, working class people could come together and demand better rights and power as a more powerful bloc. But without wider support and also some suspicion from those workers who were doing okay, most protests were to no avail. Nonetheless, people kept going, but the combination laws of the 1800s prevented people from coming together to try and improve their material conditions, in a timely reminder that what is legal can often be ridiculous, and an obvious power play to keep the poor in the mud. Working class folks found ways around these laws by forming what they called friendly societies. Basically, they played innocent to say, "Oh, aunts, we're just meeting. We're just friends who meet every week to drink and play games." Because that's not illegal, right? But friendly societies provided some of the first proper insurance for workers if they were sick or they died. Like, if you died, your friendly society, because you've been paying your dues, would help with your burial. Maybe you give the change to your wife. And so they formed the basis of things like credit unions today in the UK, or mutuals or health insurance providers in places like Belgium. Again, the friendly societies didn't take the same form. They were doing different things. With some of them, you just paid your money and then they turned up when you died. With others, they were organizing dances and social events. And so it was really a part of your life. Either way, they were really important to the social infrastructure. I will talk more about these when I talk about the Beveridge Report in a later episode. Fast forward a little bit, and people are dissembling left and right, trying to be, or pretending to be, simple, friendly societies, because you can't run the risk of being associated with anything as crass as a trade union. Because, get this, you could go to jail. This is from the Britannica website, which is an interesting starter resource. Quote, "The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 made trade unionism illegal. The laws, as finally amended, sentenced to 3 months in jail or 2 months hard labour any working man who combined with another to gain an increase in wages or a decrease in hours, or who solicited anyone else to leave work or objected to working with any other workman. The sentence was to be imposed by 2 magistrates, and appeal was made extremely difficult. Anyone contributing to the expenses of a person convicted under the Act was subjected to a fine, and defendants could be forced to bear witness against each other. Other clauses forbade employers' combinations, but these were never in any recorded case put into operation. The repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 was followed by a number of strikes, and in 1825 The repeal of the Combination Acts in 1824 was followed by a number of strikes, and in 1825, an unsuccessful attempt was made to reimpose the acts. So it was illegal to ask for money or better working conditions. I'm so glad that we left that all behind. Now you can just freely form a union without repercussions. Yay! So the combination laws were repealed in 1825, but the logic and bad-mindedness that was behind them remained very much a part of society. Yet people still continued working together, and by the Edwardian era, they had started making significant inroads. In 1888, the Match Girl strike at the Bryant and May matchstick factory in East London was one of the first of its kind. In the strike, young women who made matchsticks, the things that we use to light our scented candles of a winter's night, wanted to see an increase in their paltry wages and took action. What made it really significant and unusual is that they won. As one born in 1894, Priestley would have been aware of this strike and inspired, perhaps, to feature a similarly young lady in his story, though with different results. For the Matchstick Girls, they were helped by an exposé on their working conditions by journalist Annie Besant on 23 June 1888. They'd already been organizing, so really the credit goes to them. But the media, she had a very scandalous article. Well, the title was White Slavery in London, so I think that's really what did it. And it drew eyes, and it had an impact, drawing attention to the hard work that these women had already been doing. I really like this quote from that article because it's good writing, but also an excellent summary of the difficulty of life for these young ladies and also for poor working class people generally. The polycrisis created by the fact of being born poor. Quote, born in slums, driven to work while children, undersized because underfed, oppressed because helpless, flung aside as soon as worked out. Who cares if they die or go on the streets, provided only that Bryant and May shareholders get their 23% and Mr. Theodore Bryant can erect statues and buy parks. End quote. Does this sound familiar? Hello, anybody? As a result of the strikes, there were some retaliatory firings to punish the suspected whistleblowers and intimidate the rest. But this is where they really made progress. 1,400 women, 1,400 women went on strike as a result of this. They said, no, you're not doing that. If they don't work, none of us work. 1,400 women in the 1800s being hired by one company means that these guys, were operating at Amazon levels. Nonetheless, the women won against a giant of industry, right? After 3 weeks of strike action, Bryant and May agreed to hire the dismissed women back, improve some working conditions, including stop fining workers for minor infractions, which included dropping matches. Did you hear me? You're working in a match factory, you drop a match, they take some of your money. Unfortunately, being employed is different from being safe, and many women suffered from what was then known as fussy jaw, a disease in which the bottom of the face wasted away painfully due to the use of white phosphorus for the matches. There's a reason why matches today are red. It's because back then they used to be white, and what was making them white was phosphorus that was eating away at these match girls who were dipping the sticks into it. The red phosphorus is not toxic, and so they were able to make that change a few years later. But by then, in 1908, a lot of those girls wouldn't have survived that long. Luckily today, white phosphorus is forbidden because otherwise it would make a really horrible weapon, wouldn't it? By writing, Eva is one of the leaders of the union strike at the Burling factory, fired to set an example, but without the resultant public support, is what we saw with the match girl strike. Priestley sets up a world in which there is nowhere to go but down. I'd like to interject here by talking about something rather puzzling and ahistorical, a notion which gripped TikTok earlier this year, and which frequently makes its way back into the social consciousness. And that's the idea that there was a time when working class women stayed home while their husbands went to work and provided for them. I find this really strange and worrying because it is completely at odds with everything that we know about this world, but it ties in with the topic of discussion here. The late Edwardian period saw the rate of literacy go up due to higher levels of education. Around 1912, where the play is set, compulsory education would have seen children staying in school until the age of 12. But a lot of those children were still working. So that affected Eva in the story because she was able to get a job in a shop, because to work in a shop was seen as sort of skilled labor. You needed to be able to read and write and count and talk nicely to the customers. Nonetheless, most working class homes could not manage on a single salary or even 2 salaries, again, because the women were paid so much less. Nothing has changed. Which is why even the increase in mandatory education still stopped at 14 years old. After 14, you had to go work so that you could contribute to the family. So when I hear these people talking about, oh yeah, I want to go back to that time when my husband would be working, I could just stay home and look after the kids. When? Because if children were working as late as 1912, and Charles Dickens felt compelled to talk about how children were suffering back in 1837, when were women living these idyllic lives? Were they sending their children to work and then staying at home and living on the husband's and children's salaries? What was going on? It's a very interesting question for me. If anybody has the answer, send an email. These children were called half-timers because they would go to school half the time and half the time to work, which meant that they had very long working days, and so some of them would fall asleep in the class. So if children were working as late as 1912, while suffragists were still fighting for universal suffrage, I'm not sure when exactly women stayed home and enjoyed life. Even in the post-war period when men could go to work and keep their families on one salaries, they were generally doing some form of skilled labor. They weren't working in Walmart, right? A lot of the women would still do some kind of domestic work. For example, people talk about taking in washing. So it means that you would take washing from rich people and do it at your house, wash it, iron it, and take it back. This is something that was very common. Working class women have always been working, and if you were the sort of woman who did not need to work in 1885, well, darling, I hate to break it to you, but you are exactly who Priestley was addressing. You are the problem. Anyway, we've now started setting the scene, getting into Priestley's mindset, understanding the stories that he would have told or been told as a young person, and the influences which might have inspired him to write this story about our friend Daisy. I will now step out of that world to talk about the third influence of this podcast, the first two being the word Polycrisis and the play. In 2023, I read another article by Gillian B. White, writing in The Atlantic in 2017. In this article, she reviewed a book by economist Peter Temin. Temin, in his book The Vanishing Middle Class, talks about the negative effects of racism in the US in creating systemic inequalities which negatively affect Black people. Beyond this, other minorities and poor white people also find themselves falling into the same holes because the way in which the system is set up, people have a check-in but not really a savings. And so even if they have a savings account, it's empty because they don't have enough money. This is what led Gillian White to her enticing headline, quote, "Escaping poverty requires almost 20 years with nearly nothing going wrong." I've been trying to think through that headline for a while and finally got a copy of the book. Shout out to the Internet Archive for all this coming through. And it's obviously a little more complicated. Temin talks about the difficulties of getting ahead and then suggests that education, as it always has been, is our way out. Quote, "Education was the key to American prosperity in the 20th century. Education is the key path for people to move from the poorer sector of the economy to the richer." End quote. So that's the purpose of his book. He's like, what can you do to escape poverty? You basically need to get into education and go quite a way up. There's a word that he used to describe people who are working sort of services and technology, and those are the best jobs to get into if you want to escape poverty, because those are the jobs for the future and also jobs where you can make a lot of money. Nonetheless, due to financial or other difficulties, quote, "Only 1/3 of college graduates from the bottom quarter of households graduate, while 2/3 from the top quarter do." There's a big difference. End quote. I will now spend some time on this because, as I said earlier, this was the second factor that contributed to improving social mobility for people like Eva Smith at the turn of the century. Beyond this sad statistic, there are many more to come before we're done with this episode. Peter Temin also tells a very sad, long-ass story of a woman named Liz Kelly. Brace yourself, or maybe go get a cup of tea while you're doing this because it's long. Quote, "The problem of American student loans can be seen in the tale of one unlikely borrower. Kelly enrolled in a program at a private college as a non-traditional student who was already married with children, but represents the traditional low-wage worker trying to make the transition into the FTE sector." FTE is what I mentioned earlier. That's what he calls it. And it's finance, tech, and electronics. High-paying jobs for which you need a degree. Kelly borrowed to pay for college, I'm continuing the quote, and graduated with a degree in English in 1994. That was her first mistake. As a humanities graduate, I know that you know things, but you're completely unemployable. Let's keep going. Quote, "Her debt at graduation was about $42,000 in 2015 dollars, which is close to the debt of a typical college graduate who borrows about $32K to attend a private college today. Despite her degree in English, because of her degree in English, I would argue, Kelly did not find a job and opted to go to law school. Mistake number 2. This delayed the obligation to pay her college loan and added $37,000 to her debt in the first 3 trimesters. She then became seriously ill and required extensive hospitalization. She dropped out of law school and decided that her best bet was to be a teacher. But to be able to earn a good salary, she needed further schooling. Her husband was working and she had to borrow both for childcare and her added schooling. She stayed in grad school from 1999 to 2004. Where I'm from, that's a whole next degree, a master's, but okay. Postponing repayment of her educational loans. The interest on her loans kept accumulating at 8.25%, adding $60,000 to her debt. That debt, including her loan and the accumulated interest, totaled just under $200,000. Now, those of you in the UK will remember how disappointed we were when the Lib Dems agreed to raise student loans to $9,000. It's impossible in the UK to get into $200,000 worth of debt. So we're still... Let's give them something. Because I don't know what Kelly was paying for $200,000. Anyway, Kelly's husband lost his job in the 2008 financial crash. Remember I mentioned that? And the couple lost their house and divorced. So now they're on one salary. She then consolidated her debt at 7%. The total had now grown to $260,000. Basically a house. She tried to help one of her children in college. How? And briefly enrolled in another program. Kelly doesn't want to go to work. That's it. She now owed $400,000. And if she could not pay, the loan service would garnish her wages and Social Security. They'll be taking it direct, I think. Kelly, now 48, would like to save for her retirement. Stop it. But she has to pay $2,750 a month. Okay, that's a very high net salary for most people. And that's what they wanted to pay as debt. So what is she doing? What job? I don't want to say... I won't say. Okay. But, yeah. For the next 30 years. So she could have gotten a mortgage and paid less and owned a house at the end of it and just worked in McDonald's, and maybe she could have paid for it that way instead of going to university. She would like to declare bankruptcy, but this is not an option for student loans. She's not bitter, saying, I'm not a victim, I made choices. I don't know how I feel about that, but yes, choices were definitely made. Were they the best choices? No. Were they well-informed choices? I don't think so. But also it's very interesting that you can declare bankruptcy when you're the owner of a big company, but not when you're just a poor student. The world we live in, huh? So this is where Gillian White in The Atlantic got her headline. Basically, it's referring to the fact that with everything that was going on in her life, she might have made it if none of those extra things happened. If she had come out of university and gotten a job, and then she hadn't lost her house, she hadn't gotten divorced, 2008 hadn't happened, she would have been okay. And this is why I liked this story, because it really applies to what happened to Eva. There's a lot of, if this hadn't happened, then. But it did happen. So, according to Temin, you need to plan ahead. This is what the bit that I really like. It says, you need to plan ahead about 16 years. So you, when you're 16, if you want to be rich when you're 32, need to have the foresight to say, I'm going to pick a good degree. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to network. I'm going to meet people. You don't have these things if you're a working class person and your parents don't have those skills. They can't teach this to you. Anyway, so Liz did a degree with low job prospects, and when she could not find a job, she kept going back to school, because that's what we're taught at school, right? You're like, education will save me. No, it won't. Then with the loss of her husband's job and the subsequent loss of her home, she ends up in a situation in which her monthly debt payment alone is most people's rent and bills until past her retirement age. She's going to be working. You're going to be like, oh, why is this 70-year-old woman still here? Because she has to pay $2,750 a month. So she basically has no way out, even though she tried to do exactly the right things that we were told to do at school. So I've said it. Some of the things that we're told at school are not the best advice. Your careers advisor, if you went to school in the 90s and early 2000s, was giving you advice that worked for the 80s because that's when the books were written. It's not advice that works for the 2010s. And this is unfortunately something that we have to look at when we're talking about helping working class people to level up. How do they get access to the right information? How do they get access to the networks, which are very frequently closed loops? You know, if you go to a good school, then you have your people that you talk to and you say, oh, my kid needs something, then your friends can help you. But you don't know these things if you didn't go somewhere where you could be part of that loop. This is something that Temin is also honest about, saying, most recent graduates who are white find jobs through a social network of relatives, peers from college, and friends who inform them about and recommend them for jobs. Most white people are unaware of this difference in social capital. A similar study in the UK Civil Service found the same results, although it focused, being UK-based, on class instead of race. They found that working class students whose parents were working class didn't know how to play the game. And so even though they got into the civil service, they never went all the way to the top. So they found that a lot of people from working class backgrounds are in the civil service at the lower rungs. If you get to the middle management, it withers out. When you get to the top, zero. Yay. So you don't have the right accent or knowledge or hobbies because you can't talk about horse riding or skiing or going to Ascot. So your manager, who's an upper class person who went to private school, might not be able to connect with you. And because they can't connect with you, you never get the fun roles. Because you never get any of those fun roles, you never get considered for promotion because you were not visible enough, etc., etc. Okay, so I found the parallels between the civil service study and Temin's work interesting because it means that across both sides of the pond, these ways of determining who is going to succeed have kind of been set in stone. And poor people are cut out of the secrets to success. Let's go back in time. Go back to Priestley's world. So the case of Eva Smith was a polycrisis with interlocking and coinciding events, and the strength of the investigation lies in an inquiry that acknowledges the confluence of factors. The inspector didn't just focus on one person, he spoke to everybody, and he showed them that they were a piece of the puzzle that led to Eva lying in a mortuary full of disinfectant. In order to understand the full scale of the polycrisis, which is unfolding across the globe, or which is affecting poor people, we must begin, as the inspector did, by getting all the perpetrators under one roof and beginning to unravel the relationships between them all. That's the only way to try and understand the story of Daisy Renton or Eva Smith or any other poor person today. She was a young woman whose every effort to get back on her feet proved futile. Guys, you know, I'm really happy to be doing this podcast, but English is not my first language and some of these words are really kicking my ass. She was a young woman whose every effort to get back on her feet proved futile because there was always some middle-class spoilsport waiting to ruin it for her, and she did not have enough social capital to be able to fight back or even defend herself. Had life gone differently for her in even one of these cases, she could have potentially worked her way out of poverty, like what I said about Liz Kelly. Because education really was the key, and she had enough education, not a lot, but enough to potentially be promoted in the Burling factory. Arthur Burling, when he's talking to the inspector, he says he was actually considering promoting her to be a team leader in the factory. Then she started agitating for more wages, and they were like, get out of here. Then she gets the job in the shop because she can read and she can count, etc., etc. So she has enough to be able to go forward. This is not someone who's just sitting around and they're not trying, or somebody who doesn't have the skills even if they want to. She has the skills and she has the will. It's not enough. So, how did the question of education play out in the Edwardian age? How did we get to a stage where Eva could have that education, basically? That's the next question that I want to answer. So if we go back a little further back, we find ourselves in 1869 when the National Education League began its campaign for free compulsory secular education for all children. Before this, a lot of the work for educating people was done through religious organizations. And so you would have a very Christian education, but maybe it wasn't enough for what you needed to be able to do. At the time, one of the most prominent voices campaigning for education for children, Anthony Mandela, stated, quote, "The more you educate, the more good you have done, and the more poverty and wretchedness you put an end to. As much money has been wasted over the war in Abyssinia," Ethiopia is what they were calling, "as would educate every child in the British dominions at the moment." So I think when they say British dominions, they're talking about actually the full Commonwealth. It's a sad fact, but governments have been prioritizing war over education and social services forever. This is not a new thing. Again, comparatively, we're in the same place. Between 1870 and 1902, what we now know as primary education became both free and compulsory, and state elementary and secondary schools were established, and central government control over education greatly increased. A win. On the other side, the older folks had been pushing ahead with the trade unionist movement, and it had been growing across the UK with much opposition from establishment sources because they don't want people to learn. The trade unions were vocal supporters of compulsory education, and from the Education UK website, I quote, "Compulsory education was supported by the unions, notably the mine workers and the newly formed Trades Union Congress." If that name sounds familiar, it's because it still exists today. The Trades Unions Congress was an actual thing. It was an event held in Birmingham in August 1869, and there they unanimously passed a motion declaring that, quote from the Congress, "This Congress believes that nothing short of a system of national, unsectarian and compulsory education will satisfy the requirements of the people of the United Kingdom." The quote continues from the Education UK website. It was also supported by groups such as the Christian Socialists, and for the first time by some industrialists. Get this. It was also supported by groups such as the Christian Socialists, and for the first time by some industrialists, partly because factories had new and more complex machinery and therefore no longer needed child labor. So as soon as they were like, oh, we don't need the kids anymore, they were like, yeah, sure, it's okay if the kids go to school. I don't know if any of you ever watched Snowpiercer, but yeah. With the support in place, it was one more step to finally have compulsory education for young children. However, due to the rampant poverty among the working classes, getting children to go to school was a problem, as they needed to work outside school hours, as I said earlier. It took a while to make the case for education as people needed their children's incomes. In 1891, again, to make it easier for parents to let their children go to school, education was made free. Further legislation in 1893 extended the age of compulsory attendance to 11, and in 1899 to 12. So when we're talking about Priestley's play, and we're talking about Eva Smith, she was just the right age to have benefited from this compulsory education until the age of 12, placing her in a very employable position, which is why she was able to be a troublemaker at work, then move on to a shop. Education played a role in increasing social awareness and helping people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds get jobs as assistants and clerks and the like, which could help them cross the gulf from one side to the other. It also meant they started to become more aware of rights and the idea that they might have rights. And so in a lovely virtuous circle, this would also have led to more trade unions as people understood more about the world and they could read the newspapers that their rich employers might have been leaving lying around. The world could have been drastically different because these unions were making great inroads, and there was something called the Great Labour Unrest between 1911 and 1914, where I think there were 3,000 strikes in that time. But this was curtailed by the First World War. And then the government said you can't be striking, we're at war, you need to be patriotic. But this could have been a significant catalyst for change because it would have meant that change would have continued. Who knows what progress would have been made without the war. But, ironically, the war itself was a great leveller. During the First World War, and you can read this article in the bibliography, a lot of people saw their fortunes changing. But I would also argue that this was in combination with the higher levels of education. I don't think it would have been the same situation that people would have had better lives during the war if it wasn't for the fact that they were already becoming better skilled. So J.B. Priestley himself was able to go to Oxford because of the war. He went to the war, came out as a lieutenant, and a lieutenant is an officer. And so or a lieutenant, whichever way you want to call it, he came out as that, and he was able to take advantage of the scholarship offered to officers. And so he went to Oxford, which gave him a step up into a world that he might not have otherwise attained. We see this in studies that were carried out at the time, and I'm quoting here from the article by B.A. Waits in the reading list, if you want to read it. The second regional survey taken by Bowley and Hogg demonstrated that the consequences of the war for the labour market had reduced levels of primary poverty by more than half. The raising of the wages of the unskilled being twice as important in this process than the downward spread of family limitation, remember this phrase, in itself partly attributable to the war because of the necessary introduction of working class soldiers to prophylaxis on the Western Front. It turns out that this episode is a two-parter because I did way too much research and I really want to share it. So join me for part 2 when I'll be continuing with the story and talking about some of the other variables that affected Eva and her life. Thank you so much for joining me this far. I hope that you've enjoyed it and that you've learned something new. I certainly have. And I'll see you in part 2.